Hi, welcome back to the BCEC 2021 update. So the BCEC is the BC Electrical Code, which is the Canadian Electrical Code as it is adopted within BC. We're going to start through section 0 right now. We're going to look at a few things. There's been some things that have been added. There's been some things that have been changed. And there's been content that has changed significantly. What we traditionally used to use cable tray for now is a different purpose. So we're going to look at a few things. We're going to start with section 0. And as we talked about earlier, I am going to show you, basically, we are going to use PowerPoint. I'll just bring up PowerPoint right now. There's PowerPoint. We're going to go through it. There's my code book. We will also go through, and I really like this part of it, we will be using the Canadian Electrical Code in a PDF version. So here is the 2021 edition. It is the Canadian Electrical Code, but in BC, we refer to it as the BC Electrical Code. Okay, so let's get started. Let's just have a look through section 0. Now, there's never been a lot of importance put on section 0, but a lot of interpretations can be defined in section 0 based on the language and the definition of a word. So let's go through, for instance, let's just bring up PowerPoint here and let's just get ourselves started. All right, so the 2021 BC Electrical Code, section 0, definitions. First of all, what are definitions? In the definitions, actually the objective, scope, and definitions. So the objective is what the code is made for. What is the code? What is a code? Well, it is actually a standard. It's the safety standard for electrical installations. So if you follow the rules of the code, you will be applying a safe installation. Now, section 0, let's look at the first one. Added content. So ampacity was in there, but A and B were added to ampacity in 2021. Ampacity, the maximum current in amperes that can be carried continuously under the conditions of use. A, by a conductor without exceeding its temperature rating, or by an insulated conductor without exceeding insulation temperature rating. So temperature rating is either based on the insulation or by the termination temperature rating. So section 4 addresses this, and section 4 applies the demand and calculations to apply an ampacity to a conductor based on insulation or termination temperature rating, or TTR, based on the temperature rating of the breaker or load or whatever it may be connected to. Armor, believe it or not, armor was never in the code book. A metallic covering wrapped over one or more insulated conductors that is intended primarily for the physical protection against severe installation conditions, but is not intended to provide a hermetic seal. What is a hermetic seal? We'll bring that up in just a minute. But when you have for instance, an AC90, an AC90 has a metal armor. That is a protective covering. BX, Tech, ACWU, all of those have a metallic covering. Added language. So to cable, a complete manufactured assembly consisting of one or more insulated conductors, optical fibers, or both, which may include fillers, strength members, and insulating or protective material, and may also include a continuous overall covering providing a degree of electrical, mechanical, and environmental protection to the assembly. This is an interesting one. Cable tray. Cable tray now is a supporting means consisting of troughing and fittings formed and constructed so that insulated conductors and cables may be readily installed or removed after the cable tray has been completely installed without damage either to the conductors or to their coverings. Cable tray previously used to be considered a raceway. Now it is a supporting means. An explosion-proof enclosure. Let's just have a quick peek. So here's a couple of examples of an explosion-proof enclosure. So explosion-proof was in definitions before, but it's interesting to read because when you have an explosion-proof enclosure, it's an enclosure constructed so that it will A, withstand the pressure developed during an internal explosion of an explosive gas atmosphere, or B, prevent the transmission of an internal explosion to an explosive gas atmosphere surrounding the enclosure. C, not have external surface temperatures that are capable of igniting an explosive gas atmosphere surrounding the enclosure. See Appendix B. So it's interesting because there's a lot of people that believe the device is there to not create an explosion, but if there is an explosion within the raceway, within the enclosure, that it must contain that explosion. You don't want to have an explosion. Let's say some gas did migrate into a raceway and it's a switch. And when you close that contact, you create an arc. Or when you open the contact, you create an arc. And that creates an explosion in that box. You do not want that arc to come outside the box if that is in a hazardous location. Again, explosion proof. So with this box right here, you can see that it has got a planed metal surface. Another metal surface is machined to fit exactly on this surface. And you must have the minimum number of threads as listed in section 18. Engaged. Here's a junction box here. Pipe in, pipe out, threads in, threads out. New to the code now is National Building Code of Canada is actually looking at the buildings that we build and how they must meet flood elevation and climatic conditions within the area that these buildings are built. So it will mean that engineers will be discussing with building officials, and a lot of design will be based on the climatic area for that building. For instance, if you're in a floodplain area, you will not have an electrical room in the basement. You don't want to have the electrical room below the floodplain. So flood elevation, elevation of surface water resulting from a flood event designated in accordance with the National Building Code of Canada or applicable local legislation. Flood elevation. It is intended by this definition to recognize that a flood elevation is designed in accordance with provisions of the provincial and territorial building codes, local building codes or zoning regulations, and local flood proofing policies. A flood elevation corresponds to a flood hazard zone and may be driven by rivers surpassing their banks, precipitation exceeding stormwater capacity, ice jamming, sea level rise, and storm surging. Flood elevations are typically measured in meters above a datum such as sea level and are typically associated with a return period event, 1 in 100-year event. So if you can remember back to, I believe it was the fall of 2021, we had a lot of flooding in lower BC, and a lot of that became very evident, and it really actually amplified where this rule was, why it's been brought forward. Flood hazard zone, a spatially delineated area designated in accordance with the National Building Code of Canada or applicable local legislation as being subjected to a flood hazard. Flood hazard zone. It is intended by this definition to recognize that a flood hazard zone is designated in accordance with the provincials of the provincial and territorial building codes, local building code, local building and zoning regulations, or local flood proofing policies. Flood hazards may be driven by rivers surpassing their banks, precipitation exceeding stormwater capacity, ice jamming, sea level rise, and storm surging. Various terminology may be used to define flood hazard zones, including floodplains, floodways, flood fringes. Maps may be available in some jurisdictions to define floodplains corresponding to certain return period event. Now, if you're in the design industry, this is something you may want to pay attention to wherever the area that you're actually doing your design for. So you may want to talk to building officials. You may want to talk to the authority having jurisdiction. Again, cable tray. So cable tray has been removed from raceways. Here, and I talked about the hermetic seal earlier. So this is new, a sheath, a continuous covering that is applied over one or more insulated conductors and is intended primarily to provide a hermetic seal, to a lesser extent physical protection. A hermetic seal is any type of sealing that is that makes a given object airtight. The term originally applied to airtight glass containers, but as technology advanced, it applied to a larger category of materials, including rubbers and plastics. All right, just going to take a moment here, and we're just going to briefly touch on grounding and bonding. It is it's worthy of discussion. As a regulator, I see a lot of grounding done incorrectly. And what is grounding? It is a permanent and continuous conductive path to the earth with sufficient ampacity to carry any fault current liable to be imposed on it, and for sufficiently low impedance to limit the voltage rise above ground and facilitate the operation of the protective devices in the circuit. Pretty simple. So what is the ground conductor? The ground conductor is that conductor that goes from the electrode and ties to the neutral. That's it. Everything else is bonding unless it's the start of a new system at a transformer. So we just said what grounding is. What about bonding? Bonding is a low impedance path obtained by permanently joining all non-current carrying metal parts to ensure electrical continuity and to have the capacity to conduct safely any current likely to be imposed on it. Now, big change with low voltage being has been raised to 1,000 volts from 750 volts, and also the addition of DC voltages. So now we have 1,000 volts AC is considered low voltage. This is just a very small change. Covering has been changed to insulation. That was it for section 0. Please, if you have any questions, do not hesitate to send me a message. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you, and I'll be talking to you shortly. I will see you in section 2.